Hi there. Thanks for joining us for this week's installment of the Apartment Academy podcast, the multifamily industry's only operations-focused podcast and your institute for higher NOI. I'm your host, the Dean of the Apartment Academy, Daniel Cunningham, and today's guest is Mark Zinman from Zona Law Group, and which is a law firm representing largely, well, actually exclusively tenants. He's out of Arizona, and it's really important, I think, that we touch on the legal matters that impact multifamily owners from time to time. There's a lot to talk about, but today we started just getting focused on some of the things that have been impacted by COVID and the pandemic, and some of the laws that were enacted during that time, and what their ongoing impact has been, and where we sort of stand right now. So really great information. Here is Mark Zinman. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the Apartment Academy.
How you doing, Daniel?
Really good. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on. I think this aspect of property management, the legal side, is a mystery for many people, an annoyance for many others, but it's really important that people understand some of the things that are happening in the world today. It's important people understand the basics sort of kind of real estate laws that relates to multifamily. I know we won't get a chance to cover all that today, but let's start. Let's just jump right in and talk sort of a little bit about your firm, the Zona Law Group, where you're a partner, Mark. What kind of law does your firm practice?
Sure, thank you. So we do any kind of residential real estate, a little commercial as well. Imagine if you own any kind of real estate, we handle the gambit of issues that arise with that. The general bulk of that, though, of course, is the landlord-tenant, which is why we're here talking today. Of course, I should give the old disclaimer. I'm licensed to practice solely in Arizona, so anything we talk about today is really kind of limited based on my experience there, and this isn't actually legal advice. You know, you have an attorney on, you're going to get a disclaimer. Sorry about that. This is just for the education and the entertainment purposes.
Yes, yeah. I don't know how entertaining I am, but I do try to do the former. Okay, so landlord-tenant law, and so you're really on the sharp end of the spear here when it comes to fending off, or wait. By the way, that's for perspective. Are you generally representing landlords, or representing residents, tenants?
Yeah, we actually only represent landlords. I think it's a conflict to do both sides. We just represent too many property owners in the state that it just doesn't look good if we're on the other side of it. So we kind of draw a hard line, and that's on the apartment side. We represent multifamily operators, and then we represent the mom and pops that may own one or two homes and are just getting into the game.
So there's a lot, the last year and a half since COVID and the pandemic and the strange and arcane restrictions that have been put on evictions are letting loose a little bit. Can you give us so let's start by just talking about the state of the union when it comes to evictions. I know we're going to have to talk very generally, but what happened and what's happening now?
Sure. I mean, still, I really can't believe we, as an industry, went through the moratoriums. I mean, it was kind of unbelievable and really unprecedented. To live through it, to kind of go through that with clients, we probably did the least amount of work and yet the most amount of effort of helping clients through that. So it's kind of fascinating to look back on. I was surprised that they had lasted as long. So we had obviously a national eviction moratorium that lasted, through the CARES Act, and then the CDC, and then the various states had different laws as well. Arizona specifically released their moratoriums earlier than a lot of other states like California that have just coming up on the moratoriums. I think a real byproduct, though, is that it created a lot of hostility, frankly, between landlords and tenants. It shifted a balance entirely, that landlords had really under the gun of how they could handle their properties, and they lost a lot of control, and that caused a lot of problems on property as well. And that was the biggest part of us, is just really working with clients, not only to figure out the policies to handle COVID, but to figure out the policies of how issues were arising on property and what they could do. I mean, here locally, as soon as the moratoriums lifted, we just saw, it seemed like a lot of hostility between tenants towards managers. Once a tenant could be evicted again, if they weren't paying, it seems like it caused a lot of other problems that we saw.
And have you seen generally your clients are moving immediately to broadly evict anybody who's has been and remains delinquent during this time, or are there folks that are treating this with more kid gloves? And what does Zona recommend?
Yeah, and so I think it was an amazing narrative that the tenant advocates pushed throughout this entire thing, right? Was when the moratoriums are in place, they kept hearing it in the news from tenant advocates that there's going to be this tsunami of evictions coming as soon as all of the national moratoriums lifted. And like I said, in Arizona, we were earlier because we only had the national moratoriums at the end. And when they lifted, there was no tsunami of evictions. There was no huge flood of evictions. And that was basically in August of 21 is when everything theoretically went back to normal in Arizona. And only now we're still kind of going to pre-eviction numbers at this point. And a lot of that is because we have such a huge volume of population in Arizona. So no, the biggest pitch that I think tenant advocates have made that has been repeated is that landlords love doing evictions. It's not a part of my client's business model. That's not what they want. They want to keep heads in beds. They want to work with tenants. And obviously you have some clients are more aggressive. You have some clients that are just really working with the kid gloves. But most of my clients across the board is if tenants are willing to pay something, my clients are willing to work with them. And we advise that across the board. Do payment plans, work out of other arrangements. The eviction is the last resort for my clients. Like I am the last resort. That's it's a weird way of having a business model, but that's the reality is they come to me when nothing else works and they need to say, okay, we're not getting anywhere.
Yeah, I remember reading that there was some people were estimating 30% of all residents were behind in their rent and were going to be subject to eviction. We certainly didn't see that. There was no tsunami, as you mentioned. So is that largely because landlords are working out payment plans, or did residents suddenly all pay up? Do you think? I mean, what's the real?
Yeah, I think it's two factors. I think you touched on the one is the landlords are really working with the residents because that's a good business model. And two, I mean, there's still a lot of rental assistance out there. I mean, we've never seen a national program like that as well as, hundreds of millions of dollars have been pushed out. I think in Arizona, there's still about half the rental assistance still available. But the reality is, when the moratoriums are all lifted, it doesn't make sense that a landlord would go in and say, okay, whatever the number is, if it's 30% delinquency or 60% delinquency, say, everybody get out. I don't want anybody in my property. That doesn't work to pay a mortgage. It doesn't work to pay your employees. All of the amounts that are due to run a property. It's shooting yourself in the foot if you do that. If you can work with residents to keep them in the property, it's better for everybody. You'll be paid the money, just over time, which is much more beneficial for the property owners as well. And I think that's the general sentiment that has taken over.
Mark, some of that rental assistance came with some strings attached, right? There was if you want to accept you as the landlord, if you want to accept rental assistance, you want to take this money from the government, there were further restrictions on evictions, as I recall. Is that right?
It's not too bad, actually. I mean, at this point, at least what we're seeing here in Arizona, I mean, you can't obviously evict somebody and then you can't evict them for another 30 days through when the money gets paid. But what we're seeing across the board, I mean, we have agencies here that are paying up to 3 months in advance from where the residents are. So as long as, I think the agencies are getting better about it. They were a little slow for a while. But we're getting into a pretty good spot right now with the agencies. So I think that's working well.
And courts were backed up. Once courts started switching to virtual just sessions, just generally speaking, my understanding is that really backed up the unlawful detainer process. Is that still was that ever the case? Is that still the case? Do landlords need to think about that when they do want to proceed to eviction? Like, this is not going to be a 30-day process. This is now a 90, 100. I don't know. Is that a factor?
It's a factor, like on a case-by-case basis, but I think as a whole, not so much. I think obviously it varies by state what your processes are. Arizona, for example, you're looking about a month to go through the eviction process. We actually, post-moratorium and after everything, we actually in Arizona changed the law so that virtual courts are permanent here at the request of the parties, which I think is actually great because it's showing that more residents are showing up. They're understanding their right. They know what they're getting into. Hearings take a little longer. Obviously, showing documents, walking through people, it's an unusual task for some people. But I think it's working out really well. I don't think the actual full timeline is really taking much longer. But that's definitely state by state as to what you see.
Virtual courts will be permanent. That's amazing. Better for everybody.
As far as I know, I think we were the first state to actually legislatively pass that and make it permanent. I think it's great, though, because if you think on a simple thing where a tenant knows they owe the rent and they just want to understand their rights, them taking off work to drive however long it takes to go to court to hear a 5-minute pitch and then to take off the work doesn't make any sense. If they can call in, it's great for them. We have clients that now call in for court just to watch the proceedings to understand their stuff more. To me, it's availability, which I think is great.
Yeah, end of the month was always get ready to go to court month for property managers. They spent so much time away from the office, processing, just sitting in, as you said, just on really very very simple, like just process you have to go through, but they need to be there in person. That's great for property managers too.
Yeah, I never had the fun when I had to tell a client, well, no, I need you off property. I need you to come to court. And they're like, well, yeah, I have to do other stuff today. I'm like, well, I understand that, but we have court. So now they can kind of continue doing work, call in, and the tenants can do the same thing. So I think all around it's a great win for the industry. And I don't think that would have come, I think there's no way that would have happened but for the pandemic and us kind of shifting to a virtual world.
For sure. So it kind of sounds like it's situation normal. Everything's returned, generally speaking, back to normal in terms of evictions process and all that. There may be some extended payment plans that are lingering out there, but more or less, is everyone back to pre-pandemic behaviors?
Yes, I mean the general processes, absolutely. I think we're finally getting back to normal. Under the CARES Act, there's still kind of a provision of whether or not you have to give a 30-day notice if you're a federally backed mortgage, which is probably more legalese and detailed. I think any of your viewers know the obligations because we've been dealing with that for a while. That's the only thing I think that'll stay lingering. And then I think the big thing is more just the PR side as well. I think a lot of that came out of the moratorium and evictions, and it's become more of a federal issue than we've ever seen before, and more. I think I've seen more news articles in the past 2 years than I've ever seen before in my career dealing with landlord-tenant matters.
Yeah, the landlords have really been vilified through this process. How dare they expect people to continue to pay rent and help them pay their loans and their mortgages in the middle of a pandemic. We have clients on the Leonardo 24/7 side who have developed very complicated processes for processing evictions because absolutely positively everyone in the organization who might have a say in this needs to buy off on an eviction before it goes to court, because the chances that somebody will take up that matter and make it a public matter is much more likely now than it ever used to be.
Yeah, and that happens obviously with social media as well. Those things catch on immediately. So yeah, we definitely have clients that kid gloves across the board. I mean, they need us to hit certain checks, certain internal people on their side before we can serve basic notices, before we can go through the eviction process. It's not that it's the law doing it. It's literally just the business choice of saying, okay, we're going to hit the brakes. And that is definitely still going through to this day.
And that's spilled over a little bit now. So because paradoxically, while we were preparing for and expecting this onslaught of evictions and vacancies, which basic economics would say will drive rents down, we had this spike in rents nearly in every market across the country post-pandemic that has now again vilified the property owners. And there's some legislation. There's a lot of talk now about of rent control, and in areas where that was not present before. Mark, can you talk a little bit about that? What's happening on that front?
Yeah, and I think the narrative of landlords being vilified is leading into that. There's no question. I mean, rent control is on the ballot in numerous places right now, including places you just wouldn't expect previously. It's always even been talked about kind of in Arizona peripherally, but never caught traction, and you never know when that narrative will finally catch and keep going. And the problem is, it always comes down to a housing supply issue. I mean, we joke about it here, is that if you took the housing that we have and doubled it overnight, literally the amount of doors, the obvious answer is rents would drop immediately. Overnight, rents would come down because everyone needs to fill those things, fill those beds. And so rent control doesn't create a solution for that, but it's such an easy talking point for politicians to use, saying, oh, we'll just cap rents. Well, I mean, we saw that, for example, I think it was Minneapolis and St. Paul. They passed rent control legislation last year, and within, I think, 1 month, their building permits dropped 70%. That's a devastating data point to respond to rent control. Is like, look, investors at some point have to make some return on their funds. And if they're going into a market that will cap that, it'll control what you can put back into the property, it'll control what you can prove the property, investors will look at that and they'll look to other areas. And so I think rent control just has a devastating impact. And I also think, kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, is like where it's expected that landlords can allow people to live in their property. That's what happened during, I think, a lot of the pandemic. But we didn't really see that in other industries, right? We never saw that in the grocery world where it was expected to do the same thing, but we saw it here.
Yeah, for sure. And there was no there's no empathy for the landlord in many respects. And you can understand when it's a large national operator. Okay, I understand that. That feels like those folks have a lot of money, but there are a lot of mom and pop operators who have one or two buildings that were affected by this in a severe way and don't have cash flow to be able to kind of support the loans on the asset, the capital expenses on the asset, why their residents aren't paying. And there was just, at least that I saw, zero discourse about, that part of the market who, was as impacted by COVID as the residents themselves, I think.
Yeah, and I think that'll shift the market as well, because we saw that anecdotally across the board. A lot of my smaller clients sold out. It was a factors of, with the pandemic, obviously we saw real estate, not just rents, but actual home prices went up, obviously. And if they were in the situation where they were dealt with, well, I don't have a resident that can pay, and my home value's gone up, I'm actually just going to push out of the market and leave it to a larger institutional investor that can actually handle that risk. You actually see, which is ironic, because then people go after the institutional investor saying, oh, well, you're so bad for getting into this industry.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And the vilification continues. Now there's this lawsuit with RealPage, which we'll have to see where that goes, where the revenue management software is being blamed for collusion between communities, and in my experience, that's not how that software works. But it's just an example of any excuse to pin landlords with, the blame for rising rents or the inflationary. It's just it's sad, because my experience has been in this industry that people that serve in this industry, provide housing for this industry, have a real heart for what they do. Especially on the operations side. And to have people turn around and say they're just, call them greedy or worse, it's an unfair characterization of what I think the majority of the industry feels when they think about their jobs.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. I mean, we see that, unfortunately, all of the time, and that vilification is happening. I mean, whether it comes through lawsuits attacking the industry, legislation, it's just become very hostile, and I'm not sure why that is. I mean, truly, all the operators we work with, it's not about the greed. I mean, they're providing housing. That's why people got into it. They're in, especially on the operation side, right? They're people persons. Like that, I as an attorney may not have that skill set, but definitely like the on-site teams, the operations people, they like what they do. They like helping and providing a nice home for people. And I think that somehow always gets lost.
Yeah. Okay, so anything else on the rent control law? Anything else to touch on there? Any markets that are particularly hostile right now that you know of that people should be aware of if they're going to think of investing in the business?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to give investment advice. I think the investors are probably smarter than I am on knowing what states are less investor friendly for enacting more tougher laws. I do think it's interesting, though. I mean, this is probably the first time ever we've seen sitting presidents, and even back through the election and the previous election, talk about these issues as housing as a right as to what can be done with undersupply. I mean, across the board, though, we see NIMBYism as I see it as the biggest problem. Cities need to allow investors and developers to build. That's the best solution to a housing problem across the board. small bits and pieces aren't going to do it.
And allow them to do so at a profit. Like, it's okay for investors and developers to make a profit. They wouldn't be in this business otherwise.
Yeah. I just don't think of people, especially on the developer side, it amazes me specifically, is how long it takes to build a property and how much cash to get to that point to you're actually bringing the product, to market. There's a significant investment to go through the zoning to get everything approved. Like, there's a profit to be made there for taking that risk. It's not just simply, increase rents. That's it.
True. And also fair to point out that for those who have not ever been on the investment side, the pro forma returns for new developments, they're not outrageous 50% returns on your money. That happens from time to time. You might time a market right, and an asset ends up being worth far more than you anticipated, or rents grow far more than you anticipated. But when you develop a project, you're looking at 8 to 10 IRR returns. You're hoping to match the stock market, maybe outperform a little bit, but it is a reasonable profit for a very, I think, speculative kind of work that people do. So I have lots of respect for developers that do that and do that profitably.
Oh, I'm amazed at what they do because, your lookout time to be able to know the investment and to take that risk, you're taking a lot of risk. And there's a lot of brilliance to it.
Yeah, true. Let's switch subjects a little bit. Let's talk about some perennially bothersome or confusing issues within the multifamily world and with respect to real estate law. And one is I keep reading this, the service animals. What constitutes a service animal? What abilities does a property manager, a landlord have to deal with a pseudo service animal? Can you talk a little bit about that, Mark?
Oh yeah, it is probably the most confusing thing in our industry across the board. Fair housing, overarching, and then specifically, obviously, assisted animals are a huge confusion for on-site teams. I think when people get into the industry, they realize, okay, well, I'm going to have to learn landlord-tenant law. I'm going to have to understand what the eviction process looks like, what kind of notices I can serve. And then fair housing's off to the side, and they don't realize it until they jump into the job, realizing fair housing is day-to-day just as important as the landlord-tenant stuff. And with assistance animals, there's been confusion over the years. There's been some changes over the years. The biggest takeaway, I guess, what people need to understand is fair housing deals with assistance animals, emotional support animals, service animals. They cover all of that under the large umbrella of assistance animals. Service animals, for example, is like a dog and a miniature horse. And that's like your restaurants, bars. We have to accept all of that as well. But in the landlord-tenant world, you potentially have to accept more, things for emotional support issues, more uncommon animals. I've kind of seen it all. There's like a picture online, I'm not even joking, of like an old, a peacock being taken through an airline on a wheelchair into the airport, because airlines used to have to allow that as well. I think it's because we have so many different laws, people get confused. But for apartment managers, basically what they need to know is the person disabled, and do they need the animal for the reasonable enjoyment? And if they're going to meet that standard, unfortunately, property managers have to accept it. And we were really hoping to get more guidance from HUD on that. They came out with a guidance in 2020. And now the biggest issue, what we're seeing, is online certificates, or not certificates, certificates aren't going to qualify, but online doctors basically saying, yes, this person needs an animal. And that's going to be the biggest thing for the next couple of years, is how to handle those kind of letters from online doctors.
And what is there an answer? Like, can you challenge those sorts of things? Is it even worth it?
Yeah, that's probably the bigger question, right? Is so many times my clients ask me, "Can I do this?" I'm like, "Well, yeah. What's your operational risk? We'll fight for you." I think we've gotten to the point now where the online certificates that you see, where it literally says like, "This dog is registered," that's not going to meet the qualifications for fair housing purposes. But if you have a letter from a doctor that's saying the person is disabled and they need it, you're probably going to have to accept it. Even though I know there's a couple doctors online, like Colorado, Minneapolis, I think, and New York. I've seen enough of their letters. It's from a doctor. They probably paid $75 to get that doctor registration. You're probably going to have to accept it. The downside risk on fair housing complaints is just not worth the risk until we get some sort of guidance from HUD.
Got it. Crazy. Maybe it would be helpful also, just real quickly as we sort of wind things up, just talk about fair housing a little bit. I think, you hear property managers express frustration. Why do I have to follow this rule? This seems so silly. This is a minor thing. I don't understand how this affects fair housing. Can you maybe broadly explain, Mark, why it is that fair housing ends up with all of what seem to be these sort of nitpicky sort of things you have to dance around, things you can't talk about? Don't talk about what the community is like. Those sorts of things, Mark, can you explain why then it all ends up being important?
Absolutely, because it's really complex and things that you wouldn't think of. Look, our country has a horrible history of discrimination. And fair housing is just one of the laws to try and fix that, to put everybody on a level playing field in terms of buying real estate, renting properties, and make sure they're treated equally. So I'm a big proponent of the purpose behind fair housing. I think what happens, though, is we're at a point where managers would never overtly discriminate. That's not their intent. They want to just get their people in renting the properties, fix the issues, but there's so many caveats to it and how things are handled. And I think assistance animals is probably the most common example, right? Like, it doesn't matter to me if you need emotional support, but then you have an animal that you're allowed to have. How does that impact everybody else? And I think that's where managers get caught and just don't understand all those nuances. Like, okay, I need to allow the animal. Well, what kind of documentation do I need to do? I mean, right now, the most common form of a fair housing complaint is going to be based on disability. I think it's over 60% nationally of all complaints. Whereas historically, it was based on race. Well, hopefully we're at a point that race, whether you rent to somebody based on their skin color, is just not even a talking point anymore. I don't think most of my clients, even when they make mistakes, it's really just inadvertent mistakes. They don't mean to discriminate. They just don't understand necessarily that even when you're trying to help somebody, that can be a form of discrimination. Like, I see that. For example, I've got 2 young kids. I know that if I went to rent an apartment, for example, I'm not going to go on the second floor because, my kids are cute, but they're probably annoying to everybody else and they'd make noise. So if I was an on-site manager, I may want to help somebody and be like, oh, you have 2 young kids, don't rent on the second floor. Well, unfortunately, that's steering. You're telling somebody where they should go based on that. They don't mean to discriminate, they don't mean to do those things, but it still happens. And that's why a lot of it's just education. If they know up front, they can know what things to avoid. And just, the only thing I can always tell people is give everybody the same information. That's kind of the best answer. Like your 10-second bubble of how to answer a fair housing question, give everybody the same answer. It's the best protection you can have.
Yeah. And so training, can't emphasize that enough, the importance of training on a regular basis, retraining on these things.
Yeah, and I think the online software has gotten much, much better for that purpose, right? To go take fair housing classes, to have the education is, we're leaps and bounds where we were before. Because ironically, I think the multifamily was slow to a lot of the technology, and now that it's out there, I think the capabilities are great to learn and get educated ahead of time. And I think right now, truly with kind of like what we were talking about with hostility and more litigation arising, this time more than ever, policies and procedures are critical. Even if you're a small operator, to get those things, have them up and running, have your leases checked, have those things done is the basics of you're running a business. And to have it done properly, there's so many avenues to get that done corrected that not having it done is just, there's no reason for it anymore.
Thank you for joining us at this week's episode of the Apartment Academy podcast. The Apartment Academy is a production of Leonardo 24/7, the industry's leader in multifamily operations and maintenance software. At Apartment Academy, we realize the hard work that goes into property management and the stress that comes along with it. Leonardo 24/7 takes the guesswork out of your team's day-to-day by providing customized daily guidance on tasks that need to be done, guaranteeing consistent operations across your entire portfolio. To learn more, visit www.leonardo247.com today.